Mr. Man and the Tooth Fairy. Fairy? Fairy. Little Miss Curious was the sort of person who wanted to know, well, everything. She was the sort of person who asked impossible questions. Questions like, what does a tickle look like? Although we know the answer to that one, don't we? Yes. Little Miss Curious lived in a curious-shaped cottage next door to an ordinary-shaped cottage. And in the ordinary-shaped cottage there lived a little boy called George. George and Little Miss Curious were good friends. Well, they used to go begging together, sitting up a tree. They sat out in the garden together under the apple tree and wondered about things. They wondered about things like, why do trees have bark but don't go woof? And things like, why do trees have trunks but they don't have tusks? Tuscany. Not very long ago, the friends met under the apple tree, and on this day George had something exciting to tell Little Miss Curious. Ooh, look, he said, I've lost my first tooth. At that age, surely that's not the first. What was he, like 29? How strange, said Little Miss Curious. I wonder why teeth fall out. It's to make space for your big teeth to grow, George explained. I'm going to put my tooth under my pillow tonight. Oh, Tooth Fairy, sorry, took a while. And why are you going to do that? Asked Little Miss Curious. Mr. Men don't have teeth. She lies. So that the Tooth Fairy will come and take my tooth and put a coin in its place, teaching her to beg. I told you they were begging under the tree. I wonder what the Tooth Fairy looks like, asked Little Miss Curious. George didn't know anything. I wonder where the Tooth Fairy lives. Again, George didn't know. What a lot of questions needing answers, said Little Miss Curious. Now you've made me very curious. After lunch, Little Miss Curious met Mr. Muddle. Been in quite a few books, that one. And on the front. Hello, Mr. Muddle, she said. Do you know what the Tooth Fairy looks like? Yellow feathers and a beak, replied Mr. Muddle. Little Miss Curious was sure this was not the right answer. Oh, that's her asking him and getting nothing in return. Later that day she met Mr. Wrong, also in quite a lot of these books. Hello, Mr. Wrong, she said. I was wondering, do you know where the Tooth Fairy lives? In a tree, replied Mr. Wrong. Little Miss Curious was sure that this was not the right answer either. In a tree. So that night Little Miss Curious stayed awake, and sometime after midnight, when everyone else was sleeping, Little Miss Curious saw a soft green glow bobbing about outside George's window. Well, what? Well, where is it? It was the Tooth Fairy. So that's what the Tooth Fairy looks like, Little Miss Curious said to herself. That, little one. Also, on the front, so you spoiled it. She followed the Tooth Fairy to another house, and this time she was able to peek through the window to see what happened next. Is it not George's house? Is she just going to strangers' houses? Oh, you can see Little Boy. I might have spoilt it, but he looks like a ghost. She doesn't. She watched as the Tooth Fairy took a coin from her purse. Yeah, lies, from the mum's purse. Reached under the little boy's pillow, took out the tooth the sleeping boy had left there before he went to bed. The more little Miss Curious watched the fairy at her work, the more curious she became. Don't need to do that, I'm sure you saw it first time. Oh, there's a good picture. That's wicked. I'm curious. What's she doing? I'm really not. Little Miss Curious followed the Tooth Fairy from house to house until the first light of morning, which I guess is what you can see through the trees. Nice art. Shame about the straw. Anyway, she had to run to keep up, and the sky began to lighten. The Tooth Fairy flew away towards a wood, and in the middle of the wood there was a clearing. And in the middle of the clearing there was a tree. A very tall tree. The Tooth Fairy flew up into the tree. And of course, little Miss Curious, being the curious person she was, had to follow. As the sun rose higher, and in the sky she climbed higher and higher in the tree. Also, you've seen it. Higher and higher rose the sun, up and up went little Miss Curious, until there at the topmost branches of the tree she saw a miniature tree house. It's really little. It's not really, it takes up most of the page. And not being rude, if she's that big on that page, that house is like little, so stop lying again. Little Miss Curious peeked through the window and saw a little chair, a little table, a little bed. And there was the little fairy herself brushing her beautiful teeth, which she'd stolen from children. Like, hee hee hee. Vile. So now little Miss Curious knew what the Tooth Fairy looked like, and she knew where the Tooth Fairy lived. Her curiosity was satisfied, you think. So she went home, but on the way home she had a thought, a puzzling thought that, not surprisingly, made her very curious. Like a little cat, isn't she? And we all know what that did. Yep, little Miss Curious died. Not really. She went straight to Mr. Wrong's house. You are clever. How did you know the Tooth Fairy lives in a tree? She asked. Was I right? Exclaimed Mr. Wrong. How remarkable! I'm never right. Normally I am left. Oh, which left little Miss Curious more curious than ever. Yay! And that's the end of my show.